On today's episode, we're going to focus on political solutions. We have Zakia, Shagufta, and Farhana to weigh in on this talking point. It has been 100 days since the Zionist entity unleashed its brutal attack, and still the genocide continues. The death toll has reached over 30,000 now, with over 2 million Palestinians displaced. We simply can't keep up with the statistics. Each day we hear of more and more horrifying reports of the atrocities committed by the Zionist forces, from bombing civilian apartment complexes to hospitals to refugee camps, the indiscriminate, on-the-ground shooting and killing of civilians, the murder of journalists, and then there are those who are cold, hungry, thirsty, and homeless. They have nowhere to go. The world rulers have turned a blind eye, but we have responded. The people around the globe, from London to Turkey to Egypt, are calling for an end to the atrocities. Many are calling for a ceasefire, some for a permanent end to the occupation. Some are asking for international action and calling to international bodies such as the United Nations. And often, when attending these marches, we hear calls for a free Palestine. But what does this actually mean? How do we achieve a free Palestine? So let me begin by asking you all this very question. What does the term free Palestine mean to you? And let's start with Shum.
Well, when I've spoken to people at the different demos and marches here in London, some people have said it means end the siege and now genocide of Gaza. Some have said it means end the occupation of West Bank and East Jerusalem and the illegal settlements, and so a return to 1967 borders. People also talk about the right of return of Palestinians from the refugee camps and from the diaspora. Others, they say they wish to see a return to the 1948 borders. So they say this means a free access to all of Palestine for everyone, a place where all those with a right to the land can live there and enjoy their human rights with a sense of security. So this is for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and that they should all be able to live there together. For some people, this is under democracy, and for others, it's under an Islamic system. So what I've found is that it means different things to different people.
Rahim. I agree with pretty much all of Shagufta's points. It's very subjective. It's very dependent on the perspective that you're coming from. So I would say that the feeling is leaning more towards the two-state or the one-state solution. Those two are the most popular ones. Unfortunately, details are not always that clear. So what sounds fair and just in theory may be a very different reality. So I think this is what we want to be discussing today. And interestingly, there's also been discussions, especially around Muslims, about the need for unification and for an Islamic leadership, or what that looks like. Because what the current situation has unfortunately exposed is the fact that Muslims are completely powerless to stop this horrific genocide.
I was speaking to a really good Palestinian friend of mine about, what does free Palestine mean to you? Because, as a Palestinian, she feels, as we all do, but her particularly so, because, she's got family there, subhanAllah, who are currently facing all the atrocities that we've seen in the news. And I asked her, what does free Palestine look to you? And she said, ideally, it means that the blessed land of Al-Quds will be under the guardianship of the Muslims. And that means that all worshippers, not just Muslim worshippers, but Christian and Jewish worshippers too, will have true freedom to worship at their holy places. The Masjid al-Aqsa, surrounding masjids and the compound, the churches, the synagogues, and the Jewish holy sites will all be protected as they historically always have been. As a Muslim, this is more than just about an issue for the Palestinians or pertaining to the Palestinian people. Past, present, and future, we are connected to the land of Palestine. Historically, it is one of Islam's holiest sites. We have connections to it in our history. Presently, we feel for our Muslim brothers and sisters who are being massacred. There's a genocide being unleashed upon them by the Zionist state. And as for our future, the Prophet ﷺ has foretold that, inshallah, Islam will be reestablished in Al-Quds. In the book of Ibn Asakir entitled The Great History of Damascus, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ is reported to have said, this rule, ayi Khilafah, will be after me in Medina, then in Al-Sham, and then in the peninsula, then in Iraq, then in Medina, and then in Al-Quds. That would be its place. And thereafter, nobody will be able to remove it, inshallah. So you cannot separate a Muslim from the issue of the liberation of Palestine, from the issue of free Palestine. It is deeply entrenched in the core of who we are.
This is really dependent upon viewpoint, on political understanding, and many just want the killing to just stop right now and will do whatever it takes to achieve that. So we have seen many calling for the United Nations to do something to stop this senseless killing and destruction. So the question I want to ask is, how effective is the UN in solving or supporting a solution to the Palestinian issue?
So the United Nations, it was actually set up in 1945 by the nations that emerged from World War II. So those were China, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia. And they set up the UN to maintain international peace and security and to achieve cooperation among nations on economic, social, and humanitarian problems. And if we look at it, we can see that from its outset, the UN has had a very close relationship with the fate of Palestine. We can see that it was set up just in time to legitimize the creation of the Zionist state of Israel on occupied land. It was actually the precursor to the UN, which first committed to the Balfour Declaration, that's the League of Nations, and it promised a settler colonial project in the Middle East. And then it was the UN that deleted historic Palestine and drew up the partition plan. It was the UN that recognized the Zionist state in 1948 on occupied land, and it did not recognize any kind of Palestinian state. So to this day, there is no Palestinian state which is a member of the United Nations. Palestine, or the occupied Palestinian territories, however you want to call them, only has the status of a non-member observer state. So they have no voting power. They can't vote on any resolution. They can only make speeches.
Palestine doesn't have a vote in the United Nations, but America can, and it uses their veto power to determine the fate of Palestinians. This is surely unfair.
Of course it's unfair. But not only did the UN delete Palestine and create the Zionist state of Israel in its place, but after the events of the past few months and the lack of a binding resolution on a ceasefire, is actually glaringly obvious that the founding countries organized their power at the UN in such a way to be able to continually use that organization to serve their own interests. So we've seen how nearly all members of the General Assembly, all 200 members of the General Assembly, are voting for a ceasefire, but this leads to nothing because the results of voting in the General Assembly are non-binding. And we've seen in the Security Council, on the other hand, which is responsible for international peace and security, that just one member is able to veto the decision of the other 14 members, and its decision is binding. So just like the US used its veto power to support the Zionist state, in recent history, we can see that China uses its veto power when the Security Council debates the plight of the Uyghur people. Russia used its veto power over its attack on Ukraine. So effectively, what you have is you have 5 countries, the UK, US, France, China, and Russia, who have the power to act individually and according to their own benefit. And in doing so, they decide what the rest of the world should do when it comes to international peace and security. And this is exactly what has happened over the past few months, leading to the United Nations failing to call for a ceasefire.
You know, when you think of the United Nations, you think it's a body there to serve humanity, to serve the world. Many young people want to work for the United Nations, as this is one of the ways that they are told or believe that they can give back to the world. There are many United Nations schools, many humanitarian efforts, humanitarian projects. And some people would argue that despite this history of being complicit in setting up the Zionist state, the United Nations has still done quite a lot of work for the Palestinians. So it's not really fair to completely, write them off. What would you say to that?
Definitely there is that. And actually just today I saw on social media a call for aid, for money, for people to donate money to, in particular, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is specific for the Palestinian refugees in Palestine and actually in the refugee camps also. But what the UN has successfully done is show us that peace and human rights are not universal, and the rule of law and security are actually arbitrarily applied. And nowhere is this seen with more evidence than in Palestine. Just to give you 2 examples, if we look at Resolution 242, which was adopted by the UN in 1967 after the war that took place at that time, this calls for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the occupied territories, acknowledges the claim of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the region. And it calls on the UN Secretary General to appoint an envoy to facilitate an acceptable solution to the conflict. So it sounds great, but it has actually never been fully implemented. Even though the Zionist state supported the resolution, there was a clause calling for them to withdraw from territories occupied in the recent conflict. But if we look at it, not only are the Golan Heights of Syria still occupied, but the Trump administration actually recognized Israeli sovereignty over the area. and the West Bank and Jerusalem are still occupied. So then there was Resolution 338, and this was adopted by the UN in 1973. And if we look at this resolution, this calls for all parties to cease all firing and terminate all military activities immediately. It says the parties should implement Security Council Resolution 242 from 1967 in all of its parts and immediately and concurrently with a ceasefire. And it says negotiations need to start with an aim to establish a just and durable peace in the Middle East. So if we look at this, it's actually a bit farcical when you need to vote on a resolution which effectively says, please implement a previous resolution we all voted on. And never more so than with the Zionist state, who's actually given free rein to flout UN resolutions as it wills.
Historically, this is not the first time that the UN has let the Palestinian people down. I mean, we've seen it in this most recent genocide, how they've failed them day after day for over 100 days. But unfortunately, the Palestinian people have been massacred before. And here I'm talking about the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp massacre, which happened in 1982, September 15th. The Zionist army surrounded this Palestinian refugee camp in Shatila, and it was next to the neighborhood of Sabra in West Beirut, right? The following day, whilst they were surrounding this refugee camp, the Zionist soldiers, they allowed around 150 Falangist militiamen. Now, the Falangers were a military group known for their brutality and their history of atrocities against the Palestinian people. These people really, really hated the Palestinians. You've got a refugee camp, you've got Zionist soldiers surrounding it, and they basically let this 150 militiamen intent on and they know that they're intent on harming the Palestinians because there's documentation of Israeli officials acknowledging the fact that these people were hostile to the Palestinians, let them walk straight into this refugee camp. And over the course of a day and a half, they killed as many as 3,500 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians in the most brutal and horrific ways. They raped, mutilated, and murdered men, women, and children, innocent civilians. Okay, and you'd think so. You've got the Zionist army standing outside around the refugee camp, allowing and facilitating this to happen. And instead of stepping in to help, which obviously we know they wouldn't do anyway, they took it one step further and they actually fired flares into the night sky to illuminate the darkness for the Falangists, allowing reinforcements to enter the area on the second day of the massacre, and provided bulldozers to dispose of the bodies of the victims. Like, we've seen horrors, and a lot of my generation are seeing some of this for the first time, in real time. But stuff, this happened in Sabra and Shatila. And what did the UN do whilst this was all happening? Because literally there were statements from the Zionist army saying to the Phalangists, you've got to get out by, early morning because the Americans are putting pressure on us. They don't want, this to continue. So get out. So within a day and a half, they'd finished their mission. They left. And the press were allowed on the ground to document what had happened and showed it to the international world and international community, who were rightly horrified. And what did the UN do with all of this happening? 3 days later, they passed Resolution 521, saying, we condemn the criminal massacre of Palestinian civilians in Beirut. And it's been over 40 years later, and no one has been held to account for the murder of over 3,000 innocent civilians. They just watched and let it happen and came out with a resolution which did, frankly, nothing. So, as Shagufta was saying, to this day, the Palestinians on the UN are a non-member observer state. It's an insult because they're basically being allowed to sit at this UN table and watch as time and again the international community let the Palestinian people be massacred and murdered en masse. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that if the Palestinians didn't lose faith in the UN back in 1982 when the Sabra Shatila massacre happened, they've certainly lost faith in them now.
I heard a journalist say that, yes, United Nations isn't fit for purpose right now, but it is the only international organization of its kind. It's a coalition of almost every country in the world, and we shouldn't give up on it. We can't just give up on something this huge, and if utilized correctly, could be such a powerhouse for international justice.
If and could being the operative word here, I think, and I'm sure Craig Mokhiber thought that too. Craig Mokhiber is the ex-director of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. And he handed in his resignation end of October 2023, just last year, 3 days before his retirement, to make the point he was going to make in his letter. So when I was when I was reading this letter, it felt like that fly on the wall moment, because he discloses very candidly how ineffective the UN is. So to put it bluntly, it comes directly from the horse's mouth. There should be absolutely no confusion at all where we should stand with the UN and for any of these organizations for that matter. One of the statements he makes, quote, "I know well that the concept of genocide has often been subject to political abuse, but the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging, based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate," end quote. And then he goes on to call out the US, the UK, parts of Europe, that they are also fully complicit in what's going on at the moment. They've been providing militarily, economically, they've been providing intelligence support. They've been giving the Zionist state political and diplomatic cover for its atrocities. And he also talks about the Western corporate media as well, being the propaganda mouthpiece of the Western state. And, you know, you can see from the recent case against genocide that South Africa has issued, where on the first day, when they were giving evidence for just intent of genocide, it was not aired on mainstream media. Whereas the following day, when the Zionist entity was presenting their defense, they aired it live on Sky News and the BBC. I mean, you can't get more blatant than that, to be honest with you. He also mentions, quote, "This is a textbook case of genocide." So this is directly from the UN. "The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase toward the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine," end quote. And then later on, he talks about, quote, the so-called quartet has become nothing more than a fig leaf for inaction and for subservience to a brutal status quo. The US scripted deference to agreements between the parties themselves in place of international law was always a transparent sleight of hand designed to reinforce the power of Israel over the rights of the occupied and dispossessed Palestinians, end quote. Honestly, I felt quite foolish after reading this letter because of how damning it was. Also because of the fact that it's a lie that we've been sold, that these organizations are somehow independent, that they're impartial when they're not. Craig Mokaiba is basically saying that they knew this was coming, this genocide, they knew this was coming, and that the UN itself is complicit in what has unfolded today. And so absolutely they can't be trusted.
Let's move on to a different discussion and look at the idea of a Palestinian state. And one of the most talked about solutions to address the plight of the Palestinians is the two-state solution, that alongside the Zionist entity, you would have a Palestinian state. And this Palestinian state, it is proposed, would be based upon the 1967 borders. 1967 is the year the Zionists usurped even more land. Is this ever a possibility for the Palestinians?
It's not Palestinian sovereignty. It's not, you've got rights and rules and but sensible things that if you were to give somebody, this is your state, this is what you're allowed to do. If you were to draw up a peace plan, this is not what it looks like. Okay. The most recent version of the two-state solution was proposed by then President Donald Trump in 2020, and he called it the deal of the century, right? Now, already saying the words US, Trump, Palestine, and like peace process in the same sentence, you should already be thinking, wow, this is probably going to be a really bad idea. Because when I read it, I was like, I cannot believe this is what you've put on the table as the two-state solution. This is what you're proposing, and you expect people to take you seriously. But let me just read it out to you. Firstly, how much land are we going to give back to Palestinians? Because remember, the Zionist state of Israel is an illegal occupation, right? So firstly, the plan stipulates that Israel would recognize a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, which would leave the Palestinians with 22% of historic Palestine and allow the Zionist state of Israel to keep the remaining 78%. It also states that 87% of the territory currently under illegal Zionist Israeli occupation in the West Bank will be annexed to Israel. So they're just going to give that bit of the West Bank to Israel, like a little present, right? Jerusalem will remain the capital of Israel, and all the Islamic holy sites will be under Zionist sovereignty as well. So essentially, let the colonizers keep what they've taken, and you get a little present, a little bonus in the West Bank as well. Second point, security. Okay, this is where it gets really ridiculous. The new state of Palestine will have no right to conclude military, intelligence sharing, or security treaties with any state or organization that threatens Israeli security as defined by Israel. It will not have the right to develop military or paramilitary capabilities within or without its borders. And Israel will have the right to conduct raids in Palestinian areas if there is any threat to its security, as defined by Israel. Now, this basically is saying that the Palestinians are allowed no army, no navy, no air force, no weapons, right? It goes on to state that Israel will be responsible for the security of all international border crossings into the Palestinian state, including the Egyptian Rafah crossing, where special arrangements will be implemented between Israel and Egypt. The Israeli Coast Guard will also have the right to prevent the delivery to the Palestinian state, including Gaza, of weapons and prohibited materials that could be used to make them. So they're saying not only are you not allowed an army, a navy, weapons, you're also not allowed control of your own borders. We get to say what comes in, what goes out. You're not even allowed materials that could potentially be used to make weapons, like, steel and iron, stuff that you need for infrastructure, that kind of normal building materials. So Israel controls your border, therefore no. It also states, with regards to refugees, and we know there are millions of displaced Palestinians all across the globe, but Palestinians who have settled permanently elsewhere will not be allowed to return, i.e. there will be no right of return for any Palestinian refugee. And if you do sign this agreement of the two-state solution, Palestinian refugees will lose their international legal status and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, will be dissolved. It's like, imagine saying to the Ukrainians who were invaded by Russia, right, saying to them, look, I know what the solution is to the Russian invasion. Just hear me out, guys. Two-state solution. What we're going to do is, Ukraine, we're going to take your army away, going to take all of your weapons. Let Russia keep what it's taken. It's already taken it. It's fine. And by the way, Russia can control all of your borders and ta-da, no more fighting. Conflict's over. And Ukraine, if you don't agree to this, then you're a warmongering people. You don't believe in peace. That's basically the proposal that they've given the Palestinian people, right? This absolutely bonkers, and I'm using air quotes here, peace plan, right? I mean, people often call Gaza an open-air prison. And this two-state solution is basically asking them to just entrench it in international law. Let's make it official.
So back to Craig McIver's letter. Again, he said something quite interesting and not surprising, but he says that, quote, the mantra of the two-state solution has become an open joke in the corridors of the UN, end quote. And the reason for that is because of its impossibility in reality and for its total failure to account for the human rights of the Palestinian people. So why is he saying it's impossible? If we were to look firstly at the issue of settlements, for example, that you raised, this could be seen as the first major obstacle. And that's putting it, lightly. There is that really famous, that 4-part map that has been around for decades now. It sort of illustrates the expansion of the occupation in 4 stages. So when you look at the last map, what you see is this patchy looking green area that's supposed to be for the Palestinians. And the reason it's patchy is because it's riddled with settlements, 278 settlements and outposts to be exact. And they combine together about 700,000 settlers, which is a staggering 10% of the total Zionist population. And they have seats within the Knesset as well. So these settlements are built on private Palestinian land that's been stolen in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They are deemed illegal by the UN. They have also stated that they are in flagrant violation of international law, yet they have allowed the continuing building of these homes and the fact that they have expanded exponentially over the last couple of years. So we're talking about settlements that are as big as 20,000, 25,000, almost reaching 30,000, talking about huge gated communities. And these are not temporary accommodations. Some of them, they have schools, malls, shops. The infrastructure is pretty solid. When you have increased settlements, then that means you have increased checkpoints. When you have increased checkpoints, that means you have increased IOF. Even the roads that are then connected to these settlements, they become no-go areas for the Palestinians. These roads, settlements can be literally built between someone's land. It can be built surrounding somebody's home.
So when you said IOF,
yes, the Israeli occupation forces. Yeah,
there would be lots of these IOF forces positioned within the West Bank to guard these settlements?
Yes, absolutely, because they need security. So they're going to be manning the roads, they're going to be manning these settlements, and secure. And importantly, that they are there to. They say that they're there to secure the settlements, but actually they are there to allow the settlements attack the civilian population in the West Bank. That's actually what they're there for. We're talking about state-approved land theft. So something that was accepted by a fringe group initially when these settlements first started coming in is now endorsed by the likes of like these Knesset members like Smotrich, who's from a settlement himself. And these Zionist officials have also openly called for building more and more settlements. They're actually talking about settlement plans within Gaza right now, while a genocide is taking place. They've actually increased their budget for more illegal settlements to be built. As we are speaking right now, you go and plonk thousands of settlers in these permanent settlements right in the middle. It might take you an hour to do a 10-minute drive because of the road closures and the buildings and security and whatnot. You're talking about settlers who are allowed to carry arms. You're talking about settlers who have pretty much free access to then take more land from their surrounding areas. You have settlers who are free to attack. I know a family that are in Hebron, and they were talking about how they've actually built the settlements that are overlooking their homes. So they've had to put like a net above the open area outside of their homes because settlers are dropping food, rubbish to create an annoyance. When we were driving between Tulkarem in the West Bank to Jenin, there's a certain point where you have to basically travel between certain times because outside of those times, they might dump rubbish on the roads. They've even been known to release animals into the road to cause problems for the drivers that are traveling. And even what you're seeing now in terms of the West Bank in the last 3 months, I mean, my children's family, their grandparents, their uncles, their aunts, they're talking about how they've had to prepare their homes for imminent attacks that are coming from the IOF within the West Bank. We've seen over the last 3 months now, coming up to 4 months, in fact, escalation in the West Bank has become, unprecedented. And they've said it so themselves when we've spoken to the family back home that they haven't actually experienced anything like this in a very, very long time. Everything that you see on, in these videos, these are not fringe experiences. They have had IOF forces that come into their homes with grenades, with explosives. They've destroyed houses, insides of the houses, just turned everything upside down. They have set fire to cars. They have bulldozed the roads to basically ruin the sewage system. They rounded up not just the young men, but also the women as well. And there's been cases of where families have been locked up into one room in their own home while these IOF have basically taken over their homes as lookouts. They will use it for a day and then they'll basically leave. So the question is, are these settlements going to be removed? Are the IOF going to stop doing what they're doing? Nothing's actually going to change. And the second issue here is that Zionism aspires to expand its state. And I think this is really the underlying issue here. It would never allow any real state to exist next to it.
And this is something we can see also is happening right now in Gaza, and how they are seeking to take over land grabbing.
Because if they know that these are illegal settlements, but yet they are continuing to build exponentially, and they are bringing more and more settlers in, and the fact that they are talking openly within the Knesset about the budget for new settlements. They're talking openly about how they want to rebuild settlements, in Gaza even. Then how does that match with this two-state solution? You have to be realistic here. You can give an idea of a two-state solution, but if it ultimately goes against the actions, if you can see from the actions of the Zionist entity about what they're doing within the state, that's the reality. And if we look at the fact that from its original aspirations, they are there to expand. They want a Jewish state. Craig Makaiba said it himself. It's a joke.
They only want a Jewish. They don't want a Palestinian state next door.
And this is why you find that the vast majority in the West Bank and Gaza are not calling for a two-state.
If we look at the peace process and the different talks that have taken place over the years, it becomes actually ever more apparent that this two-state solution is a game of charades, which is being played out on the world stage. And I'd say it's an absurd, ugly pretense. Since 1948, in UN Resolution 194, the right of return for refugees and their descendants has been stated. But the two-state solution and the peace process does not address this issue. And Israel actually insists that they will never be allowed to return en masse. So this is a discrepancy between a UN resolution and the peace process. The UN partition plan of 1948, if we look at it, it drew borders for an Arab state, a Jewish state, and it assigned Jerusalem international status. But the two-state solution and the peace process, they don't recognize the borders of 1948. And the proponents of the two-state solution, namely the US and Europe, they actually ignore the reality that since 1950, Israel has moved its capital to West Jerusalem. So the Zionist state has moved its capital to West Jerusalem. Since 1967, they've occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In 1980, they enacted the basic law in the Knesset stating that Jerusalem whole and united is the capital of Israel. In 2017, the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital, and in 2018 moved its embassy, the US embassy. And then, to add insult to injury, the Trump administration, at the same time as mediating the Abraham Accords, it proposed, as Zakia outlined, the two-state peace plan. And this proposed that Israel could take the West Bank and annex it to Israel, pretty much all of the West Bank. However, the small detail they managed to overlook is that the Palestinians were not even at this negotiating table. This peace plan, the two-state peace plan, was negotiated by US and Israeli diplomats without any Palestinian input. So who does that? How can you broker peace between two parties but not even invite one of the two parties to the talks? It's nothing short of lies to talk of a two-state solution when this, as I've just described it, when this is the reality on the ground. We've said earlier on that since 1949, Israel was admitted as a UN member state. But to this day, the US government, the main negotiator of the peace process, is opposed to Palestine being a member state of the UN, which is why it's still a non-member observer state. And even that only in 2012. So there are huge discrepancies between the peace process and the reality on the ground.
It's America's path to peace. In fact, instead of progress or instead of improving the situation, it's actually made things worse.
It does not have any sincere or genuine aim or, real objective of a two-state solution. After all these years, we have to ask ourselves, what has this peace process actually achieved? And if we take each of the talks turn by turn, what did the Camp David talks achieve? They achieved peace between Israel and Egypt. What did the Oslo Accords achieve? They achieved peace between Israel and the PLO, but the West Bank and Jerusalem are still occupied. Through the Abraham Accords, we saw that there was peace and normalization between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco and Sudan. The Palestinians have asked every time these talks take place, the Palestinians have asked for a halt in the settlement building. But the Zionist entity continues building. So really, is it any surprise that in the 1948 partition plan, they were given 55% of the land, but now they occupy 80% of the land? I'd say the peace process has given Israel time and space without challenge to expand. And the peace process has given the US time and space to achieve its aim of having not only the neighboring Muslim majority countries, but also those further away make peace and normalize their relationships with this Zionist state. That's what the peace process has achieved.
What does the Quran say about seeking the help of bodies such as the United Nations, relying on countries such as America, and engaging in a sort of peace process that means we accept the occupation of our holy land?
So alhamdulillah, Islam covers everything that we ever face in our life, including things like people illegally occupying our lands and how we should deal with people who say that they're peacemakers but not. Surah Al-Baqarah 11 to 12, Allah says, when they are told, do not spread corruption in the land, they reply, we are only peacemakers. Indeed, it is they who are the corruptors, but they perceive it not. It's such an apt descriptor of the US and how the UN is pretending like they're the peacemakers in this whole process. And with regards to what the Quran says about seeking help from people like the UN and the US, Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Mumtahina, verse 8 to 9, Allah does not forbid you from dealing kindly and fairly with those who have neither fought nor driven you out of your homes. Surely Allah loves those who are fair. Allah only forbids you from befriending those who have fought you for your faith, driven you out of your homes, or supported others in doing so. And whoever takes them as friends, then it is they who are the true wrongdoers. Now, we've gone through quite extensively, I think, about how logically it doesn't make sense to seek help from those who are keeping the Zionists in power and facilitating their oppression of the Palestinian people. But even Islamically, textually, in our books, it shows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden it. You know, he says, Allah forbids you from befriending those who have driven you out of your homes or supported others in driving you out of your homes. We're not allowed to accept help from these people who are supporting the Zionists.
So this leaves us with looking at a one-state model. And either this can be a state based on the prevailing system that exists at the moment, democracy, a democratic state, or the state would be a state based upon the Islamic system of governance. Okay, let's first look at a one-state democratic model. This is actually a solution that is gaining traction. And we may have noticed that many humanitarians are calling for this. The only two countries that are not calling for a one-state model are the United Kingdom and the US. And they're not calling for this because they have long-standing foreign policy objectives with regards to this region of Asham. So those who advocate for this, they believe that in order to achieve a one-state model, we would need to take a similar sort of approach to that of South Africa. So dismantling the so-called apartheid structures. And the idea is that you would have one state with equal rights for all. You would have elected representatives, both Zionists and Palestinians, and this is what some would say would make Palestine free. What would make Palestine free is a real democracy in the Middle East.
So the Zionist state, one of its notions that it cites is the fact that they claim that they are the only democracy in the Middle East, but it uses this claim to justify its behavior. In this case, it's genocidal behavior. So if we were to look at two aspects in relation to the one-state proposal, firstly, there is an assumption, a belief that democracies believe in equality for all. And secondly, the assumption that democratic nations are morally superior. So when the Zionist entity uses the democracy card, really it should be taken with a pinch of salt. And in fact, it should be seen more like democratic window dressing, because what they've done is they've used this language, or they've used this term, being the only democracy in the Middle East, to basically cover its crimes. And it's these very crimes as to why South Africa has raised a case against them at the International Court of Justice that is ongoing at the moment. Secondly, when you're looking at a democratic state that believes in equality within the Zionist entity, in terms of what they call the green lines, which is considered to be separate from Gaza and separate from the West Bank, within that border, your nationality is actually determined by your ethnicity, and your citizenship privileges depend on whether you are an Arab Israeli or a Jewish Israeli. So even though they say that Arabs can vote, that we have Arab judges, we have Arab Knesset members, to prove that they are democratic and equal, when you actually take a closer look at some of their laws, for example, the 1950s Law of Return and the 1952 Citizenship Law, it allows any Jewish person from any part of the world the right of return and to claim citizenship, irrespective of where they're born or where their families are from or where they are, where they have been for generations. Whereas this right of return is outright denied to Palestinians that have been expelled from that land since 1948. So, you can see where the problem is here with equality. And these have been documented quite extensively through Human Rights Watch and this organization called Adala. So the reality is that Palestinians that are actually living within the green line, within the Zionist, official Zionist part, they can be stripped of citizenship if there are any charges of disloyalty or breach of trust that's brought against them. And as we speak within the Knesset, they're actually trying to bring about even more stringent loyalty oaths, and these are still pending. Essentially, you can sort of describe them as policing thoughts within the state. And even when the Palestinians have attempted to draw a petition against it, that was done in 2013, to end this kind of discrimination, the Supreme Court rejected it, saying that it would undermine the entity's Jewishness. So that means, for example, one of the things I wanted to petition was, if a Arab Israeli marries somebody from the West Bank or Gaza, they should have the right to bring their spouse over to their side. It's virtually impossible to get any kind of citizenship. If you want to marry somebody that's outside of these borders, and you have to be the one to leave. You can't bring anybody in. In these cases, you could say that the Arab Israeli population within these green lines are rendered second-class citizens, and they have reduced access to education. A lot of them are ghettoized. A lot of them have less access to healthcare. And again, these are documented within Human Rights Watch and Adalah. So these are freely available to search. The third reason why, we're looking at why it can't be the one-state solution is the fact that it is at its root a settler colony. And some academics have actually described Zionism as a ethnocratic state rather than a democratic state. So this is sort of where the Zionist entity maintains a democratic facade. Its state borders and political boundaries are fuzzy, and there is, a clear segregation between the classes of people and, of course, the ethnicities. So what does that sound like to you? That sounds like textbook apartheid. And what pushed the rights group B'Tselem to designate it an apartheid state is due to the fact that the Zionists actually, within the West Bank, a filter who can come into these areas to work, for example, based on ID systems or this kind of tiered policy that they have based on class or ethnicity. So this is something that is not new or accidental. If you go back to sort of early 19th century, looking at Herzl, he was inspired by European imperialism. And he actually, he was the one who wished for the Jewish state to be an outpost of civilization against barbarism. And one of his proteges, called Jabotinsky, he actually led a party called the Revisionists. The Revisionists actually considered the Arabs to be similar to the native Indians and the Aztecs, i.e. enemies of the Jewish state who needed defeating by armed force. And this party, the Revisionist Party, are now known as the Likud Party that sits in the Knesset today. So the reality is that there isn't, as much as there isn't any support for a two-state solution within the Palestinians, there isn't any support for a one secular democratic state that incorporates the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank from the Zionist entity. Because what it does is that it threatens the very notion of Zionism, which is the fact that they yearn for a Jewish state. If they were to allow a one state and formulate one population, then you're looking at one person, one vote. And the worry would be is that because the Jewish population would then make up less than 47%, they would then become the minority. And therefore it kind of shatters the idea of a Jewish state. And this is something that has been warned even by this Israeli demographer called Anon Sofa at Haifa University about the fact that the Zionist population is unaware of the democratic challenges that the country is sliding into, i.e. this possibility that they may become a ruling minority in the area. So, apartheid is a part of their doctrine. So you have to ask the question, why would the Zionists dismantle themselves in formulating a one state?
If this is what it's capable of, if this is what it's going to, the sort of sense of, justice and security and a society free from oppression, this is what its model looks like, then actually, quite frankly, I don't think anyone wants that.
Yeah. I mean, the idea was that 1948, they wanted to actually ethnically cleanse. So they didn't want to actually fall into an apartheid model, you could say. And there was an Israeli minister that warned them that if they were to fall into an apartheid struggle like South Africa, that this could potentially lead to their downfall.
Yeah, absolutely. But some would say that, okay, the so-called state of Israel can't do that. But if we were to look at the Western model, and let's look at Europe as an example, let's not look at the Zionist state, let's look at Europe. If we were to get consultants in from Europe, for me to ask European democracies, UK, Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, we were to get them and get some consultants in to set up and facilitate a democratic state upon the European model, would that be any better?
We have to ask ourselves, are we really surprised that Europe and the UK, secular liberal democracies in this part of the world, they see no reason to stop a genocide which has seen 10,000 children die when 2-year-old babies drown in the Mediterranean Sea and are washed up dead on beaches. Are we really surprised that they see no reason to stop the bombing of refugee camps, killing hundreds and thousands and making thousands more homeless, when off their own coasts, we've seen them sit back and watch a clearly dangerously overcrowded boat capsize and sink with over 500 refugees escaping war drowned? Were we surprised that they don't investigate claims of rape and mistreatment of women in Israeli prisons when in their own lands, Muslim women are the targets of state-sanctioned Islamophobic laws? So, liberal secular democracy in the UK and Europe, if we look at it, it has seen political groups that were once dismissed as fringe, far-right parties, they've actually gained increasing popularity, and in some countries, even power. These parties are very hostile to immigration, particularly of Muslims, and they are willing to take measures which are even illegal to achieve their aims. They're not happy with many of the EU human rights laws, and they're not happy with European commitment to the United Nations Convention on Refugees. It sounds quite similar to a Zionist entity willing to break international law to achieve its aims. So if the direction that secular liberal democracy is going in Europe is anything to judge by, I don't think we should hold our breath for any solution from this part of the world.
Farhana was talking about thought policing within the Zionist state. You have thought policing happening within Europe. There's only certain things that you as a Muslim are allowed to believe in. You have to conform to the secular liberal way of thinking and something called muscular liberalism, where they're sort of pushing their views, their ideas, their understanding of values and morals upon the Muslim communities. And then you have the cost of living crisis. If you look at European democracies, what is the situation with regards to the standard of living of the common man? People are so homeless. The homeless figures are rising. You've got so many people, going to these soup kitchens or food banks because they just can't make ends meet. And there's a crisis. And you've got United, Kingdom sending military to go and bomb the Yemenis who are suffering a famine, there's a humanitarian disaster going on there. They've got the funds to do that, but yet they haven't got the funds to increase the pay of NHS workers. So there is a real issues, the really deep-rooted issues that exist within Europe themselves in terms of their democracy and their struggles that they are facing. And this is inherent within capitalism. So within the belief of capitalism, where you take God out of the equation and you leave human beings to their own devices, then you see this corruption, you see this oppression, you see this injustice. So we can't really expect anything from European democracies. I didn't mention America deliberately because I want to look at America as a unique sort of case study, because some people will say, well, the American democracy is the most pure form of democracy. Let's work around that model. We need an American-style democracy in the land of Palestine. And because they're the champions of freedom and democracy, that you have freedom in America in its most purest form. I'm just trying to cover all bases here. I'm probably, hearing the shaking of heads from our listeners with regards to American democracy. But let's just have a discussion about this. Is that any better?
I mean, if you're to ask me, is the Zionist version of democracy, are they just doing it wrong and we need to go back to, as you called it, pure democracy in the US's model of it? I think if the US were to look at Zionist democracy, they'd be like, yeah, well done. That is the model. You've cracked it. You're doing exactly what we would have done. And that's not just rhetoric, because, and I'll quote the US Department of State website, right, and what they claim democracy should provide. So state government website, US government website says, the protection of fundamental human rights was a foundation stone in the establishment of the US over 200 years ago. In addition, democracy is the one national interest that helps to secure all the others. Democratically governed nations are more likely to secure peace, deter aggression, promote economic development, avoid humanitarian crisis and refugee flows, improve the global environment, and protect human health. The irony rankles, honestly. And it was based on this vision of US democracy that President George W. Bush illegally invaded Iraq in 2003 under the lie of weapons of mass destruction, which, as we all now know, never existed. And in his speech that happened just after 9/11, he actually said, "This is the world's fight. This is the fight of all people who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom," right? So he's definitely going under this guise of we need to protect the world's freedom. As a result of this freedom and democracy, as the US sees it, they killed, at minimum, and these are conservative estimates, right, 300,000 people in Iraq. It resulted in approximately 4 million displaced Iraqi refugees. This democratic nation of the United States set up Abu Ghraib prison, which, as we saw, had some of the most inhumane images of human torture we've ever seen. And when questioned about it, President George W. Bush actually said, well, this is an exception, and otherwise we treat them quite humanely, our prisoners. But human rights organizations contended that similar, and in some cases even more extreme behavior by members of their military had been documented as early as 2002 in Afghanistan, as well as in multiple other sites in Iraq. It wasn't just Abu Ghraib. And the Human Rights Watch in 2004 said the only exceptional aspect of the abuse at Abu Ghraib may have been that it was photographed. Like the only different thing was that we had evidence this time around. And to continue this trend of what US-led democracy looks like, in 2016, under President Obama, the United States dropped 26,172 bombs in 7 countries. And this is an underestimate, by the way, because we only have reliable data for airstrikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. Right? These are estimates. So when we look at what the Zionist state of Israel is doing, carpet bombing Gaza, well, they've got a precedence, right? The ones who taught them democracy, the US, this is how they do it. And they continue to encourage the Zionist state of Israel because they've, back in November last year, they passed a Republican plan. The US House of Representatives passed a Republican plan providing $14.5 billion in military aid for Israel. Not thousands, not millions, billions of dollars in aid.
How does Islam view this one-state model based upon democratic principles?
If we look at it, we can see that democracy has at its core this idea of freedom of ownership and benefit as a criteria for action. And what this has resulted in the past and the present, is the mass exploitation of the masses for the benefit of the minority. So based on this, more powerful countries have completed for the colonization of the developing countries worldwide. We have seen them seizing their wealth, monopolizing their resources, and sucking the blood of their people in a way which is completely against all humanitarian, ethical, and spiritual values. I mean, we're talking about Palestine, but it is shocking to say that there are actually 7 other genocides happening in the world right now. And some of you may have seen this post going around on social media. If you look at it, there are genocides taking place in Sudan, in Tigray, in West Papua New Guinea, in Myanmar, with the Uyghurs, the Armenian genocide, and in Congo. And democracy and seeking benefit have a hand in them. For us as Muslims, Allah Ta'ala said, have you, Ahmad, seen him who has taken as his God his own desire? Would you then be a disposer of his affairs over him? Or do you think that most of them hear or understand? They are only like cattle. Nay, they are even further astray from the path. And this is in Surah Al-Furqan, verse 43. And the Prophet ﷺ, he told us, whoever does an action and it is not from our deen, from our religion, then it is rejected. For us as Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that the rule is for none but Allah. This is in Surah Yusuf, verse 40. So as Muslims, we reject secularism. We reject democracy and we reject freedom. We refer to Islam in everything we do. We obey the Hukum Shari and we submit to Allah Ta'ala.
Before we end, can I ask all of you to give me one concluding point?
I think if you don't remember anything else from what we've said, remember that the 2-state solution is a joke. and it's not realistic. It's never going to happen. It's not fair. And the other thing, I know you said one point, but two things. The other thing is to remember, because I know when we're talking about democracy, some of our listeners might be like, well, that's not what democracy espouses. But I challenge you to find a single capitalist democratic state in the world today that actually has fairness, justice, and just a great standard of living for their citizens. Because it's not an exception to the rule, what we were talking about in the US and in Europe. This is just how it is. That is how democracy works.
So I concur with Zakia. Just like the two-state model is dead, the one-state solution is also dead and buried in 1948, in fact. I think we cannot forget there's a wider context to this, the fact that we have to start with the fact that this is a 75-year brutal occupation. Everything that's happened since then has all been under the guise of democracy and civility, with the full backing and support of the West. But I do believe in a one-state model, but not what has been presented by the West. I believe that we need to, move on to what an Islamic solution looks like. This has to be the next discussion that we need to be engaged in. And inshallah, I'm looking forward to discussing that for the next episode.
For me, I would say that over the past 100 days, we have seen that people all around the world are looking at the Palestinians in Gaza and asking, how have they been able to respond in the way that they have? What do they have that we don't have? And this has led to people who are not Muslim to pick up the Quran and start reading it for the first time. People are looking for what is it in this book that can speak to the Palestinians as they are going through each day and night something worse than the previous day and night for 100 days and nights now. And in the people of Gaza, we have a beautiful example. We have seen that as they face every imaginable horror again and again, they turn to the words of Allah Ta'ala in the Quran and they seek answers for what they're going through. They say, sufficient for us is Allah and He is the best disposer of affairs. So I'd like to end by saying that I'd really like to see us as Muslims start looking at what we are doing and ask ourselves, are we taking our solutions from the same beliefs and systems that created the Zionist state of Israel and everything that has come ever since, including the 100 days of genocide? Or are we taking our solutions from the Islamic belief and its systems?
So until next time, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.